Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Warm welcome and greetings, first of all, to Lady Prime Minister Ana Brnabić, Minister of Finance Siniša Mali, guests, and all of you decision makers who represent the think tank of Serbian economy and business community. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to Blitz panel, bearing the topic Geopolitics in Digital Era. To honor our distinguished guests today, we decided to hold this panel in English and to have dynamic discussion where nothing is lost in translation.
I also like to welcome you to this panel. I think that you, Prime Minister, does not need an introduction, but our second panelist, Mr. Dušan Zábrodský, is investment partner in Rockaway Capital, and I should say that he is basically dealing with the digitalization of the traditional industries and has an expertise in Eastern and Central Europe. So we'll hear you afterwards. My main goal today is to keep us on the tight schedule, so I will not take too much of your time. I would like to remind you that you can post questions on Twitter, hashtag BlitzPanel. Also, you can scan the QR codes that you have in your leaflet so you can download the presentation of our keynote presenters. We'll have a 40-minute discussion, and afterwards, you will be able to ask questions live or on Twitter. Without further ado, I would like to ask Professor Rawi Abdelal, Professor of International Management at Harvard Business School, to kick off this panel with his first introductory speech. Professor.
Thank you. All right, so good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here, and it's an honor to be on this panel with my distinguished panelists and new friends, and to have one of my favorite students invite me to Serbia for the first time. So it's my responsibility to share a few brief thoughts with you about what I would call the fragile state of the world. There are a few big trends unfolding in the world economy, and I thought I would just share some thoughts about how they're connecting with one another, and then we can have a conversation about how Serbia fits into this broader landscape. So the first of these is what I might call some anxieties about the decline of the West and a shift in the center of economic gravity in the world, away from the West and toward other more dynamic parts of the world in the East. So this is a chart that shows something pretty simple. This is national GDP divided by world GDP, or in the case of the European Union GDP divided by world GDP going back a few decades. And the way we could tell this story, and we could spend lots of time thinking about this great power transition that's unfolding in the world. But what we can see overall is that over the last 30 years, the share of world GDP that's determined by the United States and the share of world GDP that's produced by Europe is declining. This is not an absolute decline, but a relative decline. And we see the return of China to the center of the global system. Now, if we adjust for local prices, so if we do purchasing power parity exchange rates, China is already the largest economy in the world. This is at nominal exchange rates, and so that transition has not yet happened. But if we imagine over the next decade, China will grow at, let's say, 4 or 5% per year, and the United States and Europe at maybe 1 or 2% per year, that great power transition is ahead of us within our lifetimes, for sure. We're moving away from a system with one country at its center, the United States, into a new global system with two great powers, the United States and China, of roughly equal economic size, with very different visions about how the global economy ought to be organized, and increasingly difficult tensions between them, both economic tensions and political tensions. And so this great power transition through which we are living is reshaping the world economy in some fundamental ways. So this is one of the key facts of the system into which we are moving. We add to this an era of mass migration. Record flows of people, migrants and refugees, across the borders of sovereign states. As a share of world population, we have not had this many people in motion around the world, across the borders of sovereign states, for about a century. And so we are living through another era of mass migration. We have not yet even gotten to the moment in which we have mass migration that is caused by climate change, which is almost certainly ahead of us, as some places in the world become almost uninhabitable because of the ways in which the climate is changing. So this is another fact about the global system, that we are living in an era in which record flows of people will be in motion. And one of the reactions of sovereign states to these record flows of people has been to reinforce their borders, perhaps unsurprisingly, but in a way that hasn't been true for 100 years. If we think about the business books we were supposed to read 10 years ago, they had titles like "The World is Flat," "The Borderless World," giving us this sense that we were moving into a world in which the borders of sovereign states mattered less and less. And it was only firms that were the relevant agents in the world, and they would be able to move goods and services and capital and people freely across the borders of sovereign states. But how quaint that idea must seem to us today, the idea that we were headed to a borderless world. As we look around, we see even more powerful borders, borders that are becoming even more important, and even in Europe, inside the Schengen area. This is just a map that shows some new fences, some new border controls, some new police crackdowns inside the Schengen area, inside a territory that is the grandest experiment in borderlessness that the world has ever seen, or at least since the Peace of Westphalia of 1648 established the modern principles of sovereignty. So in Schengen, where nations had promised borderlessness, borders are back. And then if we think about everywhere else outside of the Schengen area, in which there was no such promise to maintain an open border, like the United States, for example, the border is back, and with a kind of vengeance. For those of you who follow American politics, you know that our debate about the southern border between the United States and Mexico is one of the defining features of our politics. So another theme, then, is that borders are back with new restrictions on the movements for goods and services and capital and people across them. Where should I be pointing this? Oops, yes. So we have a great power transition that is transforming the world economic landscape. We have the return of borders of sovereign states as one of the most relevant features of the global system. And this is in an era of increasing income inequality within nations. And the politics of that income inequality have delivered to us a new era of polarization between far right and far left, a populist right and a populist left. Let me just show you some data, I hope. There. So these are data for 6 countries. And I don't know if you can all see this from the back. And we will, by the way, distribute this presentation to everyone. You can give this presentation as a speech to your friends and family over dinner. We should all be talking about this, so do with this whatever you like. So these are data for 6 countries: United States, Australia, United Kingdom, Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. We can see that for the United States, Australia, and the United Kingdom, the share of income earned by the top 1% of income earners has increased sharply over the last 30 years. And then for countries like Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands, the share of income earned by the top 1% of income earners has increased modestly, not nearly as much. There are, give or take, 192 sovereign states in the world. If we had all 192 sovereign states and their curves on this chart, About 180 of them look like the United States, Australia, and the United Kingdom. And about a dozen look more like Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands, which is to say, this is very nearly a universal fact that within countries, income inequality has increased. Now, if we take human-to-human inequality in the world, that's a different story. Income inequality has gone down over the last 30 years, with 600 million Chinese citizens lifted out of poverty, 400 million Indian citizens lifted out of poverty into a growing middle class. But inside countries, and especially in the West, income inequality has increased sharply. This collection of facts, the anxiety about the decline of the West, the record flows of migrants and refugees, and increased income inequality have been bound up in political debates in many parts of the world and have delivered to us increasingly powerful populist movements on what we might call the right of the political spectrum. In the United Kingdom, does anybody have the computer?
Is there somebody controlling this?
In the United States, we have a right-wing populist president. Let's go on. In the Netherlands, the Dutch Freedom Party increasing its share of Dutch parliament by an extraordinary amount, not with a realistic chance of taking a majority of seats, but pulling the political spectrum further toward the right. Let's keep going. In France, Marine Le Pen almost became president of the Republic of France. We'd be having a very different conversation today if we had a President Le Pen. We might be talking about the collapse of the Eurozone and the global financial Armageddon that unleashed. In Germany, we now have a right-wing populist nationalist party with representation in parliament for the first time since the end of the Second World War. In Italy, the rise of the League, once known as the Northern League, another right-wing populist movement, also without having taken a majority of seats in parliament, but pulling the political spectrum toward the right. We'll come back to Italy in a moment. And Brazil has a right-wing populist president. Spain, in the most recent parliamentary elections, you will have noticed the Vox right-wing populist party increasing its share of Spanish parliamentary seats. What's interesting about this to me, and I think what's important about this to us as we look at the global economic landscape, is that it's not just that we have increasingly powerful populist movements on the right of the political spectrum. We have, in the same countries and at the same time, increasingly powerful populist movements on the left. We saw in the United Kingdom, Jeremy Corbyn pulling the UK Labour Party further toward a left populist position. In the United States, this man, Senator Sanders, who may well become the nominee of the Democratic Party for the presidency of the United States, a left-wing populist. I am aware, since we are in Europe, that by European standards, Senator Sanders is a moderate social democrat. But in my country, he is very far on the left. And so, for our purposes, he is a left-wing populist. Spain, and on to Greece. And we can keep going. Back to Italy. So M5S, the Five-Star Movement, essentially a left-wing populist movement, also did not take a majority of seats in the Italian parliamentary elections. But if we add up all of the seats won by M5S and all of the seats won by the League, that's about 65% of all of the parliamentary seats. It was the Center Party that was hurt in those elections as Italy pulled further left and further right at the same time. And Mexico now has a left-wing populist president. So we are living in an era of political polarization, partly as a result of the combination of these trends. And we even see some new phenomena built around a mix of left and right populism. The Gilets jaunes movement. Moving on. The street protests in Hong Kong. The street protests in Lebanon. And the street protests in Chile. Populist protests on the streets, not channeled through political parties. And can we remember what sparked these protests? In France, a fuel tax of about 15 cents. In Hong Kong, a new extradition law that would have affected maybe 3 or 4 residents of Hong Kong and was withdrawn quickly, and still the protests continue. In Lebanon, you remember what sparked the Lebanese street protests? A tax on WhatsApp of $6 a month. Now, if any of you have ever been to the Middle East, you know that WhatsApp is now regarded as a kind of human right. Like God gave us WhatsApp, so it's not for the government to tax. So a reckless policy by the Lebanese government to try to tax WhatsApp. And then in Chile, what sparked these protests? You remember, a 10-cent increase in metro fares, eventually leading on some days to 1 million people on the streets. So if you've got 1 million people on the streets, or hundreds of thousands of people on the streets because of a fuel tax, or an extradition law, or a tax on WhatsApp, or a tax on metro fares, you know that it's not about any of those things. It's about this feeling that the elites, the political elites, the business elites, are disconnected from the concerns of the average citizen. This concern about income inequality and declining social mobility. We are going to see more of this, just as we're going to see more of populist successes in electoral politics on both the right and the left. And all of this in an era of what we might call epistemological fragmentation. So I am a nerdy Harvard professor, and I am going to share with you some excellent dinner party phrasing. So epistemology is the branch of philosophy that deals with how we know what's true and what's not true. And once upon a time, we were promised that this new media landscape would deliver to us an era in which everybody knew what was true and what wasn't true. We would all have access to the same facts. And we didn't get that, did we? In fact, we got the opposite of that. We got the ability to live in our own information spaces, that we could have our own flow of information, tailored to us nation by nation, city by city, household by household, individual by individual, so that the epistemological space of the world has fragmented into smaller and smaller pieces. So, at your next dinner party, I invite you to say, you know, we are living through a great age of epistemological fragmentation. And then you can explain what this means, the fact that we no longer agree on what's true and what's not true. And partly for reasons like this. Do you know the percentage of Americans who get their news from social media every day, particularly Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube? Anybody want to guess?
10.
It's not that bad, not 80, but it's pretty high. 68% of Americans get their news every day from these social media sources. And by the way, this is the percentage of Americans who admitted this on the phone when somebody called them and asked them how they get their news. It's probably higher than this. So if this is how you get your information, and that information is filtered for you to deliver to you a flow of putative facts that are things with which you already agree, this is part of the reason why we no longer agree on what's true and what's not true. Which means that we have to rediscover the value of independence in media, the value of transparency in media, and the value of reliability in media. This is a huge challenge for us as national societies going forward, to figure out how to engage with media and with reliable, independent, transparent media sources in a way that will eventually allow us to agree on what's true and what's not true. To agree, finally, once again, on the truth. And then finally, a few reflections on this sense of fragility in the world that we might have as a result. So I've put together a composite of data that measure how well integrated the markets for goods and services and capital are across the borders of sovereign states over time, going back to 1870. Between 1870 and 1914, we lived in the first great age of globalization. And if we were having this conversation in 1911 or 1912, and we asked ourselves whether that great age of globalization would last, most of us would have said, yes, probably. And it didn't. It was destroyed thoroughly by 2 world wars, by financial chaos in the 1920s, by the great stock market crash in the United States of 1929, which was followed by equity market crashes all around the world. The rise of trade protectionism in the United States in 1931, which was followed by trade war after trade war. The Great Depression, the destruction of the global trading system, and then the Second World War, by the end of which we had definitively destroyed that first era of globalization. And then in our lifetimes, we have rebuilt a new era of globalization, one that rivals that first era of globalization with regards to how well integrated markets are for goods and services and capital. What broke the last era of globalization? The same challenges that are threatening this era of globalization. The last time the world went through a great power transition, like the one it is going through today, was 100 years ago, when the last era broke. The last time we had the simultaneous increase of right-wing populism and left-wing populism was in the 1920s and the 1930s. The last time we had this much income inequality within nations was in 1929. The last time we had an era of mass migration was in the 1910s, and we're going through that as well. All of which is to say, the same challenges that broke the last era of globalization are those that threaten this era of globalization, which doesn't mean that it is inevitable that our era of globalization will break, but our responsibility to figure out how to deal with the challenges that our parents and grandparents failed to deal with effectively, will decide our future. Will decide whether we can maintain this era of globalization, or whether it too will be broken by these fundamental challenges. And so with that, let's discuss what this might all mean.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor, for sharing with us your knowledge and expertise of not so perfect world that we are living in. So let's start the discussion, and I would start with the Prime Minister. Mr. Prime Minister, how does Serbia, given what we heard, how does Serbia fit in this picture, especially if we take into the account that digitalization is a process that is basically taking part in every part of our society? How does it affect? Is the government becoming stronger because of that, or is it weaker? Who has the power?
I agree that, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation and for organizing this fantastic panel. Then I would like to apologize to everyone here for not speaking in Serbian, but really out of respect for our fantastic guests, I want to speak in English. And I'll try to be brief, although it's a very, very complex question. I think that the world is becoming a very, very complex place, as we have seen. And for countries like Serbia, small countries, and also countries that are kind of in between 2 worlds of East and West, what we are trying to do is to really just mind our own business, focus on our development and our changes, and improve the quality of life of our citizens. In that respect, in this kind of struggle and the political struggle and the trade wars between different countries, and we can see the trade war between the United States and Europe, United States and China, Europe and the United States, Europe and China, we are really trying to very carefully balance, not politically, but really balance in order not to be, as I say, not to at any point in time be a proxy in these worldwide struggles. And I say many, many times, whenever you are living in these complex times, you don't want to be kind of the grass on which the elephants are fighting. And so we are really trying also through regional stability to pull us out of that kind of challenges. On digital, I would say that obviously, it's a trend that is changing the world with this whole fourth industrial revolution as we know it. I personally, although there are many, many challenges coming with digitalization, I see it as a huge opportunities for countries like Serbia for several reasons, and I'll try to be brief. Firstly, now is the time for countries that were not the winners of the third industrial revolution or previous industrial revolutions to catch up, jump a few steps, and try to position themselves better. Secondly, there is finally advantage that I see for smaller countries. Like in the economy, if you look at kind of big, huge multinational corporations, and smaller startup businesses or small companies, smaller companies find it easier to change. They're more flexible. They can be more dynamic if they're dedicated to it. So in the time of the Industrial Revolution, whatever that may be, it's easier for small countries to change and adapt and become the leaders. And finally, I think now is the time for something that has been, throughout the past 3 to 4 decades, one of our key disadvantages is constant changes, lack of strong institutions, disruption. We can finally turn this into our advantage now. Because if you ask more developed economies, more institutionally strong societies, what is the biggest threat they see from the fourth industrial revolution? They see it's disruption. It's the fact that you don't know what to expect tomorrow or in a week or in 10 days. And for us, we are used to living under these circumstances. We are adaptable, fast-changing, creative in that sense of the word. So disruption is something that is finally our advantage and the disadvantage of others. So I think if we are well positioned, very smart, although with all of these challenges, I think we can turn out to be one of the winners of the fourth industrial revolution. And politics-wise, we will have to see how these things change, but from where I stand, I hope that there will be more dialogue instead of more protectionism in the world.
Thank you very much for the elaborate answer. And Dušan, your advantage here is that you're basically coming from outside, but you have the expertise on the Central and Eastern Europe, especially in the digital transformation of the large companies. How do you feel and see Serbia since you've been coming to Belgrade at least a few times in the last few months?
Yes, you are. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Yes, you are right. We are quite experienced investor in Central and Eastern Europe, specializing on digital transformation in the businesses that are kind of focusing on traditional industries. And I have to say that now Serbia, similarly to the entire Balkans, is quite underdeveloped when it comes to digitalization. And that's giving you actually a huge opportunity to grow from there. Just to give you a few stats, according to my information, basically share of online or e-commerce on entire retail, it's less than 1%. compared to, for example, Czech Republic, that it's over 12%, and UK 20+. So it's just showing you the huge room for improvement. Or, for example, number of e-shops. In Czech Republic, we have over 40,000 active e-shops, which is similar to the UK. Hungary is about 5,000, Slovenia is 300, Serbia is 100. Yeah, so it's just, again, showing you on some data points where you currently are. And as I said, that's giving us huge room for improvement and huge room for growth.
Thank you.
That's why we are looking at this market.
At least from my angle. Professor, you tackled the question of the rising populism. And also the Prime Minister mentioned the current trade wars, ongoing trade wars, especially what we are interested in, and we talked about it last night a little bit, is what's going on with China and US. There is a huge disturbance in the messages that were sent, especially from the US, because of the China technology getting involved in the infrastructure of the 5G. So can you at least give us, should we worry as small country, Serbia in Europe, should we take care who we choose as our partners?
Well, I think we should all worry in the sense that the great opportunity for countries seeking to develop further over the past 30 years that opportunity has mostly been outside of those countries. It's mostly been in global markets. And so insofar as some of these tensions threaten to put us into an era of fragmentation of global markets rather than integration, I think this should be of great concern. I think the fact that the fragmentation is being driven by the United States primarily is one of the most curious elements of our era. If you look at the survey data, only 40% of Americans think that globalization is a force for good in the world. I mean, this must be surreal, right? The United States, more than almost any other country, was responsible for helping to build this era of globalization. And 60% of Americans think that globalization is a force for bad in the world, which is one of the reasons why we are delivering to ourselves in the United States these globalization skeptics on both the left and the right. And so if we think about that in combination with the American concern about being overtaken by China, this feeling that the United States is in decline and China is on its way up, this is, I think, the fundamental political cause of the trade tensions and other geopolitical tensions between the United States and China. And then the debate about 5G is just one small part of this broader contest, great power contest between the United States and China. Realistically, what this means is that the United States is going to hold itself back in terms of technological progress by not engaging with some technologies that China has simply become better at producing than the United States. But I think these tensions are a semi-permanent element of our new global system.
How can, Prime Minister, small country as Serbia, as you mentioned, fit into this picture? Are we going to go in the middle way? And I want to elaborate in the fact that digitalization is changing relations between citizens and the government. Is government losing its power because everything is going to be much more transparent, and we should tackle a little bit more about open data and the idea that everything that government possesses as a data should be something that could be useful for businesses, for example?
So 2 or 3 questions there. I'll try again to be brief. Firstly, I think that the whole digitization is completely changing the politics and the governance as we know it. And we have seen this through social media, and especially Twitter, and especially with President Trump, who has basically set up a completely new standard of Twitter politics, and basically announcing some of the key strategic decisions firstly on Twitter. And now, that's the trend that, after all, we need to follow. The social media is also changing the dynamics between citizens and politicians. We are becoming much more approachable. You can easily read what people think of your work, of some of the policies. People can easily complain to you, raise some of their specific issues. And at least for me, it is very difficult to just reject that and not act on it. Obviously, one of the key issues there, as Professor has said, is this huge problem with fake news. And so there, I think, all of us will have to find a way of, in the future, of how to deal with that. And I think, again, that education is basically the cornerstone of where should we start that battle with the fake news, learning from countries like Finland. And as of 1st of September this year, we are introducing a subject called digital world in the first grade of the primary school, so that kids can really see, understand the world that they're living in, understand its challenging opportunities, and so on and so forth. So I think that in general, everything is changed. The economy is changed, the politics is changed, the governing is changed, and I think that contributes at the same time, while it contributes to greater democracy, it also is challenging some of the key things of what does it mean to democratic society through the fact that we have multiple truths in today's world. And so I think, at least for responsible politicians, governing has never been as hard as today.
Thank you very much. Professor, just go back to this digitalization trend. Generally, is the strengthening of the digitalization, is it weakening the authoritarian regimes? Is it something that we could expect to work out on positive side?
I think there's been a contest within countries between sovereigns and civil societies about whether these kinds of technological transformations strengthen the sovereign more than they strengthen civil societies. And within some authoritarian regimes around the world, what we've seen is that in some of these cases at least, the sovereign has grown even more strong than civil society has grown as a result of these new technologies. And we just think about the possibility of the sovereign to use its superior computing power compared to almost any private agent or any firm. And its ability, if the CIA of the United States wanted to listen to this conversation through my mobile phone, which is turned off, it absolutely could. And we've seen moments when sovereign states just turn off access to the internet, or turn off access to social media, or indeed turn off access to WhatsApp. And so in moments of great tension between civil society and authoritarian regimes, I think what we've discovered is that these technological changes have ended up strengthening the sovereign even more than they've strengthened civil society.
Thank you very much. And Dušan, as we heard, is this geopolitical risk that exists really, how much are they crucial for the companies for their decision to invest? I mean, how much it has influence on business decision nowadays?
Yeah, if I would basically avoid the political part of that question, I would more look at it from the the addressable market size, because that's to me the most important criteria, where any kind of digital business or business case, if to do the digitalization or not to do the digitalization, it basically all depending or is the market big enough to actually worth the investment. And that's where I really see that we need to, as investors, look at it if there are actually use cases where we can create the platforms that are, let's say on regional basis rather than on just, nation basis. Because we have Serbia, 10 million people, less than 10 million people. That's not necessary is going to basically justify the case. So we have to be looking at it basically like cross-Balkan platforms. So that's basically the answer.
Thank you very much. We just scratched the surface of this topic. I believe that, but we are on a tight schedule, and we want to get you involved in this panel. So please feel free. I think we'll have opportunity to hear at least 3 questions at this point. Just state your name, state your question clearly, and we'll answer it. Please, is there somebody willing to break the ice? Is it really that we didn't kick off? Okay, so I have more questions just for the final round. Prime Minister, is our existing IT infrastructure sufficient enough to provide a really digital transformation? Not just government, but businesses also.
It's a very complex question, because when we talk about the infrastructure which is supposed to sustain and support this transformation, we, in my view, talk about the infrastructure that we need to introduce the e-government and m-government. We need the infrastructure in terms of digital roads, like broadband infrastructure. We need educational infrastructure to really just increase the number of startup innovation companies, provide for an ecosystems which will encourage people to participate in this transformation and provide opportunities. We have done a lot in the past 3 years on all of these fronts and all of these aspects. In terms of e-government, I have to say that we have set up together with Telekom Srbija the government data center, and we have started building another kind of backup and disaster recovery big state-of-the-art data center in Kragujevac. So we'll have a full infrastructure for e-government ready by the end of 2020. In terms of broadband infrastructure, Serbia is quite well positioned. We have about 60% of our inhabitants covered by the broadband infrastructure. For the remaining 30%, by the end of March, we will have a call for mid-mile capex subventions, so to introduce broadband to the remaining 30% of the population, focusing primarily on 600 local communities, 90,000 households, and we also hope that that will again work to solve the internal migration problem in Serbia. In terms of the educational infrastructure, by the end of 2020, we will have as much as 4 science and technology parks. That's basically the best, by far the best, not just in the region in terms of the Western Balkans, but South and Eastern Europe. We are investing over 100 million euros into infrastructure for research and development, science, scientific institutes, and all of these things to really just enable for a conditions so that whoever has a good idea, with the support from the Innovation Fund, the Science Fund, can actually change our economy and our society together. And I did not answer to important part of your previous question, open data. When we adopted the e-government law in 2018, we have made opening of the data mandatory. We are still struggling with that. We can check on the open data portal to what extent we have opened, and the state institutions, ministries, local governments are slowly opening the data. So that is something that I think is one of the key ingredients of the transformation of the society. So I think that now, after really just focusing on this, introducing also programming and coding as mandatory subjects in the primary schools and so on and so forth, we are now today really well positioned to really see a very good results and the key transformation in 2020, 2021, 2022.
Sounds like a strong base. Oh, now we have a question. Thank you. Yes, please take the mic.
Hi, Nebo Đurđević. A question for Professor Abdelal. Given that there are those two great risks that you identified, one internal inequality within states and the other one with the changes in the power centers, we are living in the global world, which is quite integrated with respect to the business elite, at least, like those that are haves, and political elites as well. And having in mind what you just said, is there evidence that this issue of inequality is being taken seriously and in a systematic way globally? Because we have that connection, a number of business elite forums, political forums, because it has been written about in major serious magazines for quite a few years, per se.
This is a great question, and I think one of the challenges that we face, and I think let's call it the global cosmopolitan elite, broadly understood, has increasingly felt the bitterness of national societies that recognize that this new cosmopolitan elite that spans countries has more in common with each other than they do with people who hold the same color passport they do, with the citizens of their own countries. We've seen some efforts to try to tackle the problem of inequality within countries. Not very successfully in the United States, not very successfully in other parts of the world, but if we take the French case as an example, after the French state has intervened to tax and redistribute, the Gini coefficient, the level of inequality in France, is actually lower today than it was 30 years ago. But France still has this moment of revolution, this moment of frustration. And so I think it's more than merely the difference between haves and have-nots. It's more than the inequality itself. It's the sense of unfairness about the inequality. And in a way, what we have more profoundly than a wage gap or an income gap is a kind of dignity gap. The gap between the dignity that comes from having work that provides meaning and purpose in people's lives, in addition to the income that it provides. And so I really think that we need to have a lot more political creativity to deal with this dignity gap. It's going to take more than merely redistribution. It's going to have to be finding ways to create national societies that have economies that benefit majorities. And any economy that doesn't benefit a majority of its citizens is not a system that can persist. I think the positive side of this is we see increasing opportunities for business and government to collaborate. And this will be, I think, one of the defining features of societies that manage to deal with this transformation more effectively. Where there's a partnership between the private sector and the public sector that's very robust, those are the societies that are going to flourish in this next stage.
Thank you, Professor. Now I see hands.
There's also one in the way back.
There's one in the way
Short
back.
question from my side to Anna. Going back to digitalization, we have recently seen a broad mass campaign about digitalization in a country. What was the aim of the campaign? Are you satisfied with it? And what is your assessment of the overall awareness of mass population in Serbia, what the hell digitalization is?
I think that, and I'm very proud to say this, that the people in Serbia have accepted digitalization much more quickly, much more efficiently, and much more readily than I initially expected. If we go back to 2017, when I became the Prime Minister, and in my expose, in my manifesto, digitalization was basically the key concept and the highest priority of the government that I lead, I think very few people really understood, and many people laughed and did not see Serbia in that respect. If you ask people now, and I've seen some of the opinion polls, really majority of the people in Serbia perceive digitalization as our unique opportunity for the future growth, development, a chance to catch up. Now, even the older population in Serbia has acknowledged what it means and what benefit brings the digitalization of public services, that is introduction of e-government. And I'll tell you, for example, one single service that has really explained to especially senior citizens what is digitalization all about and what it brings to them was e-prescriptions, e-recept. Now, they then understood that digitalization to them means that they do not have to go back every 3 weeks to their GP so that they can, wait in line, and GP wastes her time to write a prescription for the same medicine that they're taking for 2 years. That this is all automatic now. It's not waste of their time. They don't have to go back to the hospital, to their GP and do this. I think many younger people today, 3 days into us introducing e-government, and we are still at the very beginning. We've really just for these past 3 years, we're setting up just the foundations, the databases, the data, and in parallel started to introduce some of the e-government services so that the citizens and business cannot wait. But today, if you ask someone who's 20, 22 years old about, is it very difficult to get this birth registry certificate, they would think you're crazy, because it's not needed anymore. And if it is needed, then they go to the e-government portal and just order it online, and they get it to their home address. So for us, 4 years ago, getting the birth certificate was like hell. It was a nightmare. It meant waste of time, going through public administration, waiting in lines. It meant hell. So the country is, in my view, changing faster than I anticipated, which again means that we are used to disruption and we are adapting really well. In terms of the campaign, all of the campaigns that we are doing are kind of explaining to people, sometimes in a kind of funny ways, what digitalization is perceived as, flying cars or microwave pizzas and stuff. But if we can't do this, at least know that we've done all of these other things and this is where we are going. So I think that this is again, I'm satisfied because again I think that broadly our citizens understood, and I think that as a country, as a society, I think we are talking more about digital than most of the other countries in the world, and I'm very, very happy because of that, and that will certainly bring us results.
I think we have time for one more question from the public. The gentleman in the back.
Thank you very much, very kind of you. My name is Goran Svilanović, and I'd like to bring us back to geopolitics. Mr. Abdelal, while answering to one of the previous questions, you referred at a need to redesign our understanding of equality in the society, and I'm grateful for that. But I'd like to introduce another element you have presented, and this is migration. So we are very quickly coming into a new situation of a need to redefine who the society is and add to this equilibrium migrants, number-wise and labor force-wise. Those parts of the labor force who do not vote, but is producing. So this will actually change a lot our understanding of who is society and who do we want to bring closer to being equal with each other. So to stop here, I'd like to invite you to continue elaborating on migration. How does this add to geopolitics in the digital world? And would I, of course, like to address Prime Minister Ana Brnabić, as I praise the attitude of the government being champion in the wider region when it comes to the attitude towards migrants. But respecting the fences as being presented, perhaps this is the moment in time to reconsider what is coming in the next year or years. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Please, Professor, and then Prime Minister.
Well, it's a great question, and I certainly think it's an important topic. And I can assure you that if I thought I had an answer that I could give in 60 seconds to one of the most vexing geopolitical questions of our time, I would just tell you the answer. And I don't have that answer. But I do think that we have to have a new kind of conversation, national society by national society, that sounds something like the following. What is the contract that we offer to migrants? What kinds of migrants will we allow in? And what are the things that those migrants will have to do for us to recognize them as part of our national society? Is it to do with language or religion or cultural practices or education? That's going to be up to every national society to come up with its side of the contract. What do we expect of people coming in who want to be part of our society? And then the people who come into our societies have to fulfill their end of that contract. I think one of the challenges that we have right now is that, take the United States, a country that has traditionally been very good at this. We have a kind of contract. We haven't written it down. It's implicit. But many migrants, including myself, I was not born in the United States, many migrants and refugees coming into the United States understood what the contract was, and we fulfilled our end of the bargain. But what's happening now in some countries, like the United States, is that national societies are failing to live up to their end of that original contract. So even if we do everything that we're supposed to do as migrants in order to become part of these societies, what do we do if that other side of the contract breaks? So it's this debate, and I think using the language of contract is basically right. We should sit down and talk together. What do we expect? And can we promise, if we have our migrants deliver what we expect, that we will in fact treat them in a dignified way and treat them as though they belong? And I think that's really the defining debate that we're going to have society by society.
Prime Minister, care to comment also?
Sure. 2 points. Firstly, again, as of 2015, 2016, when Serbia was hit hard by the migrant crisis, and we dealt with it extremely well. We've kind of protected the borders from illegal immigrants, let the legal or registered migrants in, and then showed like very human face. Also opened the schools to migrant children, which was unique, I think, almost in Europe. And I'm very proud with how Serbia handled that. But since that time, we've called on the EU to discuss and adopt a common European policy on migration. So not EU policy, because countries like Serbia have an issue because these migrants are coming to Serbia from the EU countries, going further into the EU countries. So common European migration policy. Unfortunately, that did not happen, never happened, and it seems to me that this current crisis has again almost surprised Europe. Now, we will have, and we have kind of almost daily communication with our neighbors to discuss the common approach to this. Frontex is going to play a major role. I'm going to have a meeting with my team on Friday morning to see how we are going to protect our borders, but more importantly, I think how all of us will support EU borders where it matters. And so, I think that unfortunately right now, again, it's probably not realistic to count on a common European migration policy apart from what's happening now, which is good, a common border protection, what it matters, and that's basically Greece. And secondly, again, on kind of geopolitics, migration, and digital, I was surprised when one of the big things, as Professor said, that we did not even see yet is the migration because of the climate change. which is going to be, in my view, even bigger issue than current reasons for migration. If you see, for example, South Africa, Cape Town is the first world major city that has run out of the water, climate change. So it's going to be huge. But when we are discussing the climate change and environmental policies, I've rarely seen people talk about e-government as a way to... We've seen the energy transition, which is obviously important. But Serbia, tiny Serbia, has introduced automatic exchange of information between public administration. I remember on 1st of June 2017, I remember the date because I was really very proud that we've started this system. As of 1st of June 2017, and not everyone has immediately joined the system, so it happened gradually. As of 1st of June 2017 to beginning of this month, we have, as public administration, including local governments, exchanged over 100 million information automatically, electronically, meaning that we did not print over 100 million papers, A4 papers, documents. Meaning, and I've asked our Office for IT and e-Government to basically transform that into trees and water and electricity needed to produce that paper, meaning that tiny Serbia, from e-government to date, and we are at the very beginning, has saved about 10,500 trees and about, if I'm not mistaken, 22 million liters of water to produce that paper. Can you imagine if the entire world would go digital in terms of governments, what kind of impact that would have on the climate change? So I think that that's a big opportunity where, again, digital can really help us impact the environment and then prevent the huge climate change from happening and then prevent from further migration and so on and so forth.
Thank you, Prime Minister. I think that clearly answered your question. We should not leave and forget Dušan. Maybe you can just give us a brief answer and put us from the geopolitics into Serbia economy question. Where would you invest quickly so far? What is your main target? Where would you invest as somebody who's coming here and looking for a potential?
Yeah, so basically to quickly answer this question would be the e-commerce. But I would like to a little bit connect it to what Prime Minister was saying regarding to the basically governmental services and digitalization of that. It's kind of comes hand to hand with basically digitalizing the private sector, because what's really important is for people to really become comfortable with the digital services. They need to be comfortable with using online payments, and they should actually expect such services from the companies. And I think that that's the movement which we need to kind of start in both private sector as well as in public sector. That's basically the people kind of push us to do this digitalization, and that's why I believe the e-commerce is kind of the most natural thing where to start and what's kind of closest to the people's behavior.
Thank you very much for your clear answers. If you want to add something or not, I think we were at the same time informative and interesting. I hope that everybody learned from this panel a lot. I would like to thank, first of all, Prime Minister, Professor, and Dušan as our panelists. And thank you. We are moving on with the second part of today's panel. Thank you.